long before the white domes of the Taj Mahal glistened beneath the rising sun, before the gardens were carved with symmetry and silence, there was a woman dying in blood-soaked linen. Her body trembled against the hardwood of the birthing bench, drenched not in honor, but in failure at least by the standards of empire. She had been brought into the world to serve, and now she was leaving it the same way. They called her Mumtaz Mahal. She was 29. This was her 14th labor. For 30 hours she had cried out under the suffocating heat of June, while outside the imperial tents, the emperor waited in silence. The child she carried was not just hers, it was the empire's. Another attempt at legacy, another chance at a son. But the child who arrived was not a boy. The women attending her did not speak. They cleaned the infant quickly, wrapping her in cloth before bringing her out to Shah Jahan. The emperor took one glance, then looked past her. Inside, Mumtaz lay limp, her breath staggered. The bleeding had not stopped. She whispered something they could not hear, and before dawn, she was gone. They said he wept for her, that he wore white for the rest of his life, that he built a tomb for love. But the men who served him whispered a different truth. The tomb was built for memory, not mourning, for order, not heartbreak. Mumtaz had given him 14 children. She had followed him into war camps, into jungles, into palaces still smelling of gunpowder. She had become what the empire demanded of her: silent, obedient, reproductive. Her death was recorded not with grief, but with urgency. The emperor had no time to weep. He still lacked enough sons. Ministers began discussing new wives, alliances, fertility. No one asked if Mumtaz had wanted to carry 14 pregnancies in 19 years. Her will had never been part of the equation. The marble that would one day shimmer like a jewel in the heart of Agra was silent on this part of the story. It carried no image of her body torn apart by delivery, no inscription for the daughter who was born the day her mother died, only symmetry, beauty, control. The Taj Mahal stood not as a monument to love, but as a mausoleum for expectation. Generations later, thousands of miles away, another queen would stare at her own blood on silken sheets. The year was 1700, and she had just lost her only living son. Her name was Anne, Queen of Great Britain. 17 pregnancies, no heir, and like Mumtaz, she was a woman whose body had been made a vessel for power, only to be discarded by history once it failed. But Anne's tragedy carried no domes, no minarets. There would be no marble to remember her womb. Only silence, again. And silence, as always, remembers everything. There were no white domes to mark her grief, no gardens of symmetry, no mausoleum rising from the earth to whisper her name into eternity. Only a stone tomb in Westminster Abbey, cold and austere, surrounded by 20 tiny coffins, each one a closed chapter of a story no one wished to remember. Anne sat beneath the crimson canopy of the royal bedchamber, her hands resting on a silk sheet stained red. The child had not lived, again. They didn't tell her directly. They didn't need to. She had learned to read the silence, the subtle shift in a midwife's shoulders, the heaviness of breath in a room where life was supposed to begin. This had been her 17th pregnancy. No one spoke of how many children had died, not aloud, but everyone knew. The court physicians kept ledgers. Ministers marked each failure in the margins of political scrolls. Her body had become a royal subject, tracked, observed, documented, and each time it failed to produce an heir who lived, the weight grew heavier on her spine, her lungs, her name. Anne had once been a girl who dreamed of horses and music. She became a queen who measured time not in years but in miscarriages. Some children died before they took a breath. Others survived a few minutes. A handful lived long enough to be given names. William was the only one who smiled. He lived 11 years long enough to give the realm hope, long enough for Parliament to craft a future around him. And then he died. One night in July, his lungs gave out, and so did hers, in a different way. She buried him beneath stone, but the empire buried its future with him. Anne reigned over a country she could not give an heir. Her authority was questioned, her judgment scrutinized, behind her back. They whispered of God's punishment, of cursed blood, of incompetence. But no one dared question the burden. No one looked her in the eye and called it what it was. A woman dying slowly under the weight of a crown she was expected to preserve with her body alone. Her legs swelled with gout. Her womb became a battlefield of scar tissue. By the time she turned 40, she could no longer walk without assistance. Ministers met in her chamber because she could not stand in the council halls. Every time she appeared in public, she was trussed in heavy garments that hid the decay beneath. But she never cried. She didn't have the time for it. There were laws to pass, wars to finance, dynasties to hold together by threadbare lineage. She once wrote a letter in the middle of the night, the ink shaky and scattered across the page. God forgive me. I have no more to give. No one saw it. It was never sent, but it remained tucked between the pages of her Bible, unread until after her death. Anne was not remembered as a mother. She was remembered as the queen who failed to continue the line. After her death in 1714, there were no children of her blood to inherit the throne. The House of Stuart, centuries old, collapsed like a worn tapestry, unraveled by time, loss, and a womb that could carry no more. They summoned a distant cousin from Hanover, a man who barely spoke English. The royal bloodline had to survive, even if it skipped across borders and languages. But what remained of Anne was sealed away in Westminster, alongside the 20 coffins of the children she never raised, never watched grow, never heard say her name. She had lived for them. She had buried them all, and no monument carried their faces. Far from the limestone vaults of London, across borders and centuries, another woman would rise to power with a crown not just on her head, but pressed against her flesh. Maria Theresa of Austria, 16 children, an empire at war, a womb that served as the last line of defense in a continent shifting under blood and ambition. Anne had died with silence pressed against her lips, but Maria would learn to speak through pain and to rule through it. Anne died with the silence of her bloodline sealed beneath Westminster stone. No heir, no memory the crown wished to preserve. But in the heart of Europe, not long after Anne's tomb was closed, another woman stepped into power, not through triumph, but necessity. Her name was Maria Theresa, and unlike Anne, her womb would not fail the throne. Instead, it would be conquered by it. She was 23 when her father, Emperor Charles VI, died. The men around her called it a crisis. The empire could not pass to a woman, they said. The pragmatic sanction meant nothing. They insisted, but no treaty or tradition could change the simple truth she was all that remained. They came for her borders first. Armies moved like shadows. Kingdoms tested her. Diplomats questioned her authority, even as she sat on the throne. While emissaries debated her future in candlelit chambers, she went into labor. Her first child arrived while troops amassed on the outskirts of her lands. Her second was born during a siege. Her third while she negotiated a treaty with hands still shaking from blood loss. Her pregnancies became as much a political act as they were physical endurance. She did not have time for weakness. The empire moved with or without her breath. Each child born was a coin minted in flesh, spent not on love, but diplomacy. She watched her daughters learn the languages of distant courts, their bodies prepared not for youth, but for marriage. Their hands were kissed by men 3 times their age. Her sons wore uniforms before they knew how to write. There were no lullabies in Schönbrunn Palace, only schedules, suitors, and succession. She kept portraits of all her children arranged on a long table in her private study. She moved them like pieces on a board. Johanna would go to Naples, Maria Josefa to France, Marie Antoinette to the Bourbons. Their smiles were captured in oil and pigment, but she rarely saw them in person once they were married off. They were no longer hers. They belonged to dynasties. Still, she buried 4. She never cried in public, but behind closed doors, her mourning was endless. When Johanna died of smallpox before her wedding, Maria Theresa stood in silence beside the unopened bridal chest. When Maria Josefa died days before taking her sister's place in the same marriage, the empress stood even longer, saying nothing. The portraits remained on the table, but she stopped rearranging them. Only one child ever looked at her and asked why he was being sent away. Charles, her younger son, he was 10. She answered with a soft voice and tired eyes. Because you are needed elsewhere? He bowed, kissed her hand, and never returned. Her husband, Francis, stayed mostly in the background. They shared something close to affection, but he was never her equal. He died suddenly, and she wore mourning black for the rest of her life, not just for him, but for all that passed through her and disappeared. The empire survived, but she did not. Her body, once a vessel of strength, became heavy with pain. Her joints burned, her chest ached, her breathing shortened. She aged faster than her years. In the portraits painted late in her reign, her eyes looked past the artist, as if fixed on something far behind them, on a memory she no longer wished to recall. When Marie Antoinette was sent to Versailles, she stood on the border between Austria and France, stripped of everything Austrian before being handed over. Maria Theresa did not attend the ceremony. She stayed behind in Vienna, standing alone in the window of her study. Her daughter would become queen, then prisoner, then corpse beneath the blade of revolution. The letter informing Maria Theresa of her daughter's imprisonment arrived months before her own death. She read it without tears. She placed it beside the portraits. She had given her body to a continent, 16 children, decades of rule, wars fought, treaties signed, and in the end, what remained was silence once more, like Anne, like Mumtaz. Power had not spared her. It had consumed her more completely than any illness could. Her portraits faded into galleries, her treaties yellowed on forgotten parchment. The daughters she sent away became ghosts in foreign courts. The sons she raised for thrones were lost in revolutions she never lived to see. But across the Alps, in a palace darkened by suspicion and silence, another woman was still waiting. She had waited 10 years, childless, voiceless, unwanted. And when the child finally came, she would not offer the world love. She would offer it calculation. The court of France did not speak her name with reverence. Catherine de' Medici was not queen, not truly. She was the Italian, the childless one, the quiet shadow beside a king who barely looked at her. But silence teaches what noise cannot. And after 10 years without children, without power, without even a seat beside her husband, she understood something that would never leave her. In a palace built on heirs, a woman without a child is already halfway to the grave, unless she learns to make herself the architect. She tried everything. She swallowed powdered pearls mixed with ox marrow. She lay beneath moonlight with herbs packed around her thighs. She drank tinctures of horse urine and bathed in water blessed by priests who wouldn't meet her eyes. Her chambers reeked of desperation masked with lavender. The bed where a future king should have been conceived became a place of rituals, of pleading and stillness. But still, no child. Her husband, Henry, spent his hours with Diane de Poitiers, older, silver-haired, and powerful. Diane was everything Catherine was not: graceful, adored, and in possession of the king's attention. The court knew it, so did Catherine. And in that knowing, something in her began to calcify. Then, quietly, without ceremony or miracle, she conceived. The doctors called it a blessing. The priests called it divine. Catherine knew better. It was not salvation, it was currency. Her first son arrived red-faced and screaming, and with him came the shift. Her position changed, her voice was invited. The rooms that had once ignored her opened their doors. But she had not forgotten the decade of scorn. Her joy was brief, strategic. She gave birth to 9 more children, each arrival greeted with relief by the court, and by Catherine with a cold nod. Motherhood did not soften her, it armed her. The children were not nurtured, they were positioned. Each son a fragile placeholder for the crown. Each daughter a marriage contract in the making. Catherine arranged their lives like a chess master, studying the board years ahead. And when her husband died in a tournament, a lance splintered through his eye and out the back of his skull. She did not scream. She did not grieve. She took his ring from his dead hand and locked the palace doors. No one saw Diane de Poitiers again. But France was not at peace. Her sons were weak. Her court, fractured. The country smoldered with religious division. Protestants and Catholics slaughtered one another in alleys and cathedrals. And at the center, Catherine stood mother of kings, widow of a fractured house, holding the weight of a dying monarchy in hands calloused not by labor, but by negotiation. She tried diplomacy, she tried marriage alliances, she tried silence, and when all of it failed, she turned to blood. The marriage of her daughter Margot to the Protestant Henry of Navarre was supposed to bring calm. It brought carnage. Saint Bartholomew's Day arrived with screams. Bodies were thrown from windows. Rivers ran red. The massacre began without her word, but it ended because she did not stop it. She watched from a balcony as Paris burned beneath her. History called her manipulative, cold, calculating. Perhaps she was. But she had also been the girl who lay beneath moonlight soaked in shame, the woman who birthed 10 children in a court that once wanted her gone. She had earned her hardness. She had survived when no one expected her to, and she had ruled when none of her sons could. Her sons, Francis, Charles, Henry, wore crowns too heavy for their spines. They leaned on her until they collapsed. She buried them one by one. The throne passed like a curse. The longer she lived, the fewer people dared meet her eyes. Power had given her everything except peace, except love, except rest. In her final months, she rarely left her chambers. The court carried on outside her doors. France stumbled forward. She spent her time among letters and portraits. The faces of her children looked down from oil-painted frames, young and unknowing, frozen before they could disappoint her. She wrote notes to no one, folded them, burned them. She had ruled when no one believed she could, and when she died, the court exhaled in silence, not out of relief, but fear. Catherine had long known that power did not love, and sons did not remain sons once they tasted thrones. In the final days, she wrote nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already watched her lineage break itself apart. She had birthed kings who left her behind. Centuries earlier, another woman had lived that same fate not through whispers or poison, but chains. Eleanor of Aquitaine had raised kings, and those kings placed her in a prison of stone, before the cold walls of her cell closed behind her. Eleanor of Aquitaine had already outlived more than most men dared to live. She had been queen of 2 empires, wife to 2 kings, mother to 5 sons, each of them forged to rule. But power never forgives the hand that shapes it. And when her sons turned their swords not toward enemies, but toward their father, the wrath did not fall on them. It fell on her. She gave Henry II 8 children. Her womb bore the Plantagenet dynasty. Her hands raised future kings. Her mind outmaneuvered lords and ministers. But she had opinions, and worse, ambitions. Henry never forgave that. At first, she was a queen, then a mother, then a liability. She supported her sons when they rebelled. She did not hide it. She fed their cause with quiet counsel, with the knowledge of alliances she had crafted in the shadows. And when they failed, she paid the price. 16 years in confinement, not in a dungeon, but in gilded captivity, cold castles, guarded doors, conversations supervised by men loyal to the crown, but not to her. She was stripped of her influence, but not her dignity. She endured. She learned. She waited. When Henry died, her chains were lifted not by forgiveness, but necessity. Richard the Lionheart, her son and champion, came to power and restored her freedom. He made her regent in his absence. And suddenly, the woman forgotten behind stone became the ruler of England. She traveled tirelessly in her 60s, securing alliances, preserving her sons' fragile legacies, calming noble feuds. She did not rule with sword or spectacle, but with letters, whispers, and presence. She had no crown on her head, but everyone in Europe knew whose word mattered. But even she could not hold time still. Her sons died one by one, Geoffrey in a tournament, Richard by a crossbow, John the last. The weakest would become king, and in doing so, undo much of what she had spent a lifetime shaping. Her daughters, married away for political gain, faded into foreign courts. Some died young, some disappeared into scandal and silence. The children she bore for empire never returned to her as children. They came back as news, as names, as eulogies. She retired to Fontevraud Abbey not as a nun, but as a sovereign grown tired. It was quiet there. The prayers were soft. The air smelled of wax and stone. They buried Henry there, then Richard, then Eleanor herself, 3 monarchs beneath the same roof. But hers was the tomb at the center. She had birthed a dynasty and watched it die in fragments. She had been chained for loyalty, exiled for foresight, restored for necessity. They called her dangerous, too proud, too alive. She never apologized. Because in the end, she had never been forgiven for being more than just the mother of kings. The chains that held Eleanor were made of stone and law. The ones that bound Victoria were stitched into corsets and contracts. Across centuries, the throne never ceased demanding children, only changed the shape of what it cost to provide them. Victoria did not want to be a mother. She said it plainly, to herself and to her diaries. She found pregnancy repulsive, childbirth revolting, and infants no more than burdens that sapped her body of strength and her spirit of clarity. And yet, she bore 9 children. She carried them not from joy, but from duty, not from love, but from lineage. She was not allowed to despise it aloud, so she despised it in writing, in whispers behind closed doors, in the icy stillness with which she handed her newborns to nurses and turned back toward matters of state. She married Prince Albert Young, out of affection, but that affection did not save her from the obligations of fertility. Their marriage was productive, predictable, the rhythm of state papers followed by childbirth. Year after year, her body bent to the will of inheritance. Each child meant security for the crown, a piece of diplomacy in flesh and blood. She hated every minute of it. The doctors did not understand postpartum melancholy. They called it weakness. Victoria called it despair. After each birth, she would fall into weeks of silence, unwilling to see ministers, her children, or even Albert. But recovery was not hers to claim. The empire waited, the ministers waited, the world watched. And so she rose from bed, adjusted her skirts, and signed legislation with fingers still trembling from birth. The children were raised in order, not in intimacy. Nannies replaced affection, tutors replaced storytelling. The nursery was a place of governance, where rules eclipsed tenderness. Victoria did not apologize for this. She did not see motherhood as the height of womanhood. She saw it as a tax. And Albert, her husband, filled the space she left empty. He loved their children perhaps too much and guided their education with an exacting hand. He was her partner in throne and bed. But when he died in 1861, something in her shattered beyond repair. She withdrew, not for weeks, but for years. Black became her only color. Public appearances ceased. Ministers begged for her presence. Subjects rioted for her return. She remained behind curtains, dressed in mourning, the empire ruled by silence. In that void, her children grew into adults awkward, emotional, ambitious. Victoria watched them pair off with European royalty, extending her bloodline into nearly every throne on the continent. They called her the grandmother of Europe. But it was not affection that earned her the name, it was strategy. Her daughters were married into Germany, Russia, Sweden, Spain. Her sons inherited dukedoms and titles and the pressure to carry an empire forward. But they also inherited something else disease. Hemophilia, the blood curse, spread through her descendants. One by one, her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would bleed from cuts that could not clot. Her genes, passed through the line, brought down more dynasties than her alliances ever secured. The House of Romanov, the Spanish crown. Even her own lineage strained beneath the weight of the sickness she never knew she carried. She watched from her writing desk as the 20th century approached. The world changed, and her children disappointed her in ways both public and personal. Affairs, scandals, political failures. Victoria wrote long letters, stern, cold, absolute. But the children no longer listened. They had become monarchs in their own right, rulers of smaller worlds. They carried her name, but not her fear, not her restraint. Victoria ruled for over 60 years. She watched the monarchy transform, the empire balloon, the world industrialize beneath her reign. But she never escaped the shadow of childbirth, of the expectation that her body served not just her country, but all of Europe. She was queen, empress, mother, but the title she hated most remained the one written on birth certificates and in history books, mother of 9. She died in 1901, surrounded by children, who owed her their crowns and little of their warmth. Her death marked the end of a century. Her life marked the beginning of countless stories in palaces across the continent, stories of sickness, war, collapse. Her bloodline would carry more than names. It would carry consequences. Eleanor had been imprisoned for birthing rebels. Victoria was entombed in marble for birthing monarchs. Neither was free. Both had given everything. But freedom was never the reward for women who made empires with their bodies. Victoria had ruled with a pen and a cold gaze. Her children were pawns on a continental chessboard. But the woman who came before her, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, did not wield power in letters or diplomacy. She ruled only within the walls of a nursery, her empire built not of land, but of lullabies, blood, and the sound of crying infants that never ceased. Charlotte did not complain. She was not allowed to. She arrived in England at 17, married to a king she had never met. George III greeted her at the garden gate of St. James's Palace. He said she was lovely. She said nothing. Within a year, she was pregnant. By her 21st birthday, she had given birth 3 times. 15 pregnancies, 13 surviving children. Each year marked not by celebrations, but by the cycle of swelling, pain, delivery, and the brief silence before it began again. Her body was never truly hers. The physicians charted her womb like cartographers mapping an empire, each successful birth a territorial gain for the House of Hanover. She lived under ceilings painted with cherubs, but rarely saw the sky. George adored her, at first. He called her his dearest consort. They sat together in their box at the opera, hands briefly touching, smiles exchanged. But love, in royalty, is a fragile indulgence, and soon it faded beneath the weight of expectations, tradition, and madness. The first signs were small, a forgetful remark, a restless night. Then the letters became incoherent. The speeches to Parliament ran too long, spiraling into frantic declarations. He shouted at shadows. He wept in hallways. He called Charlotte by the names of women long dead. And as his mind unraveled, so did hers. But she did not fall apart. Instead, she stood, every morning. She dressed as if the court were still watching. She received foreign dignitaries with polished sentences and steady eyes. She oversaw the children's education, their diets, their uniforms, and the appointment of every tutor. She smiled when she had to, and when the door closed behind her. She allowed herself the collapse. Her husband raged behind palace walls, and she stood between him and the world. No one taught her how to be queen to a mad king. No one showed her how to raise sons who feared their father, or daughters who asked why the king did not recognize their names. She answered with silence. She told them he was tired, that he needed rest, that kings carried burdens children could not understand. She watched her eldest, the future George IV, drift into cruelty. He drank, he lied, he squandered money and trust. Her daughters grew bitter in spinsterhood, unmarried and locked in gilded prisons of propriety. They stayed by her side not from love, but because she would not let them leave. The family became a collection of occupied rooms, bodies housed near one another, but sealed in grief. Charlotte herself became more statue than woman. She aged without celebration. She endured pregnancies without tenderness. When her youngest daughter died at 27, Charlotte did not cry. She sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, and whispered something no one heard. And then she kept going, because that was what queens did. In her final years, Charlotte became nearly invisible. The court changed around her. Ministers rose and fell. Her sons fought over inheritance and insulted one another in newspapers. Her husband no longer recognized her. Sometimes he screamed when he saw her. Sometimes he asked for her hand and promised to marry her again. unaware they had wed decades before. She held his hand anyway. When she died in 1818, it was not in a blaze of remembrance. The empire noted her passing, then resumed its march forward. Victoria would rise to the throne less than 2 decades later, stepping into a monarchy made possible by Charlotte's quiet sacrifices. But history seldom wrote Charlotte's name. It counted her children, not her endurance. Eleanor had been chained for raising warriors. Victoria had been celebrated for multiplying kings. But Charlotte had lived her life, in the shadows of a mind unraveling, surrounded by children she did not choose, in a palace that never paused for her pain. She had given more than blood to the crown. She had given silence. Charlotte died in silence. No grand procession followed her coffin across Europe. No poets marked her passing in verse. The woman who had given birth to 15 children, who had shielded a crumbling monarch and stitched together a fraying dynasty, was lowered into the earth beneath Windsor's gray sky without fanfare. Her life had been one of duty uncelebrated, unthanked, and unspoken. But she had not been alone. Across centuries, in different courts and different empires, other queens had lived the same script beneath different names. The details shifted, the languages changed, the palaces rose in marble or crumbled in revolution. But the expectations remained carved in stone. A queen's body belonged to the crown. Her worth was counted in sons. Her sorrow was never hers to express. Eleanor had been caged because her sons became lions. Victoria had been embalmed in mourning because her children carried her blood into history and disease. Charlotte had faded from memory because she never dared to scream. They were not exceptions. They were the rule. Mumtaz Mahal died in the shadow of a monument built for love, but rooted in the price of bearing 14 children. Maria Theresa signed treaties in one hand, while cradling infants in the other, her body always returning to the battlefield of labor. Catherine de' Medici endured decades of infertility, humiliation, and derision, only to produce sons who tore France apart. None of them ruled in peace. Even those who sat on thrones were never sovereigns over themselves. The crown gave no sanctuary from pain. It only polished the walls of the prison. Behind the silk curtains and diamond brooches lay bodies torn by childbirth, minds weathered by grief, and hearts trained to beat quietly. These women loved their children in ways the world would never know through survival, through silence, through the willingness to be forgotten so the bloodline would not be. They were mourned not in monuments but in empty cribs. Their legacy was not only royal lines, but whispered sorrow carried down corridors long since emptied of their names. And yet, the history books rarely spoke of their exhaustion. Their bodies filled crypts, but not pages. It is easier to remember kings who conquered than queens who bled. And still, they endured, one birth after another, one stillborn after another, one war, one alliance, one funeral after another. They did not break because they were not permitted to. And when they did break, they did it in private, beneath layers of silk, behind locked doors, behind the crown itself. In the end, the greatest monuments to their pain are not palaces or portraits. They are the stories that never made it into public memory, the names of the children who died before christenings, the nights spent waiting for husbands who loved power more than presence, the quiet rage of women who knew they would never be remembered for anything other than the children they carried or failed to. But in that forgotten space lies their true power. Because they built legacies not just in kingdoms, but in resilience. Because they survived things that were never meant to be survived. Because they made the impossible repeating it, surviving it, living it their duty. Not for glory, not for love, but because history demanded it, and they obeyed.